بعد نجاحها في ضمان استقرار عرشها بعد إقناع كل من السعديين والعثمانيين بإقامة علاقات تجارية ودبلوماسية مع إنجلترا، سوف تتجه الملكة إليزابيث إلى مرحلة جديدة، وهي مرحلة التواصل المباشر مع السلطان مراد الثالث والسلطان المنصور الذهبي. وتحتفظ لنا سجلات التاريخ بالكثير من هذه المراسلات التي تظهر كيف أن الملكة حاولت استغلال الجانب الديني وأيضا التحذير من عدو مشترك وهو إسبانيا، لكن هناك هدف خفي يظهر من خلال هذه المراسلات أيضا.
From the late 1570s, she looks at the fact that many of the English commercial companies are trading with Muslim kingdoms. So the Barbary Company is working in North Africa. What's called the Turkey Company is obviously working with the Ottomans. That becomes the Levant Company eventually. So she's watching all her merchants do this, and she's thinking this might be the possibility for a political alliance to connect trade and commerce with the Islamic world with a political alliance. So from 1578 really she starts reaching out to the Ottoman Sultan Murad, and she starts writing letters, incredibly friendly letters, saying, you are the great emperor of the world. I am an emperor in this small island. You and I have much in common. Our common enemy is Catholicism. And then she writes sensationally saying, Protestantism does not believe in saints. It does not believe in intercession. It believes in the power of our holy book. My understanding of Islam is that you do not believe in those things either. You believe in the power of your holy book. We have much in common.
ذكرت الملكة إليزابيث للسلطان أنها تؤمن بالمذهب البروتستانتي وأن تنكر المذهب الكاثوليكي، وفي الحرف الواحد قالت إنها تؤمن بالرب الحقيقي، تؤمن بالرب الذي يعاقب على الوثنية، وأن البروتستانتيون يشبهون المسلمين في اعتقادهم. هكذا ذكرت في رسالتها. وفي الحقيقة كان رد السلطان، يعني الجانب العثماني تأثر بهذا الكلام كثيرا. رد السلطان عليها بالرد الجميل، يقال أنه دعاها للدخول في الإسلام.
We have stories of Englishmen who start to talk about how they are understanding, for instance, the theological distinctions in Islam between what it means to be Sunni and what it means to be Shia. Now this is fascinating. This is in the 1560s and 1570s. I challenge many people in England today who are non-Muslims to tell me the theological distinctions between Sunni and Shia.
So there's a number of letters that are dispatched between the two sovereigns, between Elizabeth and between Murad III. Now, a lot of these letters, by their nature, are kind of generic. There's a particular way that you have to write in diplomacy. You have to show off your titles as the ruler. So Murad, the first part of Murad's letter is just basically him listing all the many places that he's the Sultan of. But it's also showing respect to the person you're writing to. So He gives Elizabeth some nice titles. He calls her the supporter of the Christian faith, the most important of the Christian princes, the leader of the followers of Jesus. These are things that make her seem a very important person, but it's just Ottoman diplomatic etiquette.
The nature of these letters also adhered quite closely to the formal aspects of the relationship that was emerging between England and the Ottomans. And in this respect, they tended to focus on these issues of trade, the formal arrangements by which English merchants could come to the empire, trade, and then return.
لم تكتف الملكة إليزابيث بالتواصل مع السلطان مراد الثالث. تشير الوثائق التاريخية لوجود علاقة جمعت الملكة بزوجة السلطان مراد الثالث صفية، صاحبة النفوذ والتأثير داخل البلاط السلطاني.
Especially in the 1590s, we see emerging a relationship between Elizabeth I on the one hand and Safia Sultan, who's the wife of Murad III and ultimately the mother of Mehmed III, who succeeds his father in 1595. Around these years in particular, Safia emerges as a very important player in the Ottoman court by virtue of her role as wife and then mother of a future sultan. Safia had a great political role to play.
مشاركة السلطانة صفية، طبعا في اللغة العثمانية يقولون سلطان للمذكر والمؤنث، زوجة السلطان مراد الثالث، ومن قبلها أيضا مساهمات لأم السلطان مراد الثالث نوربانو سلطان. فهناك أشياء كانت تريدها زوجة السلطان وأم السلطان وتحققها في سياسة الدولة. وكانت إليزابيث راسلت زوجة السلطان مراد الثالث وبنت علاقات جيدة من هذا الجانب أيضا.
And in fact, Elizabeth sought to cultivate a relationship with Safia. The terms of this relationship were certainly still diplomatic, but they could also be more personal. It was a communication that could be established between ruling women in a certain way, a sisterly relationship almost. These letters, therefore, certainly have great political or diplomatic import, but they also cast a different kind of view of who Elizabeth was and what she was about.
Now, the content of the letter is largely friendly. They're paying each other compliments, they're exchanging beautiful gifts with each other, jewellery and clothes that are sent between the two. But also in one of the first letters, Safia offers Elizabeth to intercede on her behalf with the Sultan. If you tell me what you want, she says to Elizabeth, I will whisper it into the Sultan's ear.
As a result of this exchange, Elizabeth I ordered the construction of a really fabulous carriage, a carriage of great cost and great intricacy, one that was intended as a gift for Safia Sultan. In these letters, the carriage is mentioned, and Safia anticipated the arrival of this gift in Constantinople with great anticipation. Along with the carriage, the English also sent a really fabulous mechanical clock and organ.
She receives clothes and jewellery from Safia, but going the other way, there are other presents. So in around 1600, there's a present, a very special present arrives in Istanbul from Elizabeth. One is a giant mechanical organ for the Sultan that plays music and has mechanical figures. But for Safia, she gets a beautiful English carriage that will draw her along in the streets of Istanbul.
تكشف المراسلات بين الملكة إليزابيث والسلطان السعدي عن الهدف الحقيقي التي كانت تسعى له ملكة إنجلترا، ولم تحتفظ سجلات التاريخ إلا بعدد قليل من هذه الوثائق، من بينها هذه المخطوطة التي استطعنا الوصول إليها، والتي تقول فيها الملكة إنها تباحثت مع مبعوث السلطان السفير النوري مسألة التحالف ضد الإسبان رفقة وزيرها روبرت سيسل، وإن هذه المسائل على قدر كبير من الأهمية والتعقيد، مما لا تصلح معه أن تكون موضوعاً للمراسلة. ومن ثم فقد خولت لهنري بران، وهو إنجليزي من المقيمين في المغرب، ليتفاوض بشأنها.
بالنسبة للمراسلات العديدة التي تبادلها أحمد المنصور مع الملكة إليزابيث، المواضيع التي تناولتها هي قضايا الساعة التي كانت تهم الطرفين، ومن أهمها مواجهة عدو مشترك وهو الإسبان. من بينها أيضا موضوع مساعدة ولي عهد البرتغال لاستعادة عرشه، من بينها محاولة حصول إنجلترا من المغرب على مواقع على المحيط الأطلسي لاستخدامها ضد المراكب الإسبانية التي تتجه إلى أمريكا أو إلى العالم الجديد.
ولكن على رأس هذه المواضيع قضية التجارة والنظر بعناية للتجار الإنجليز ومنحهم حظوة بين التجار الأوروبيين. هذا كان معظم الرسائل التي كانت تأتي إلى أحمد المنصور كانت يعني في هذا النطاق. كذلك مسألة أخرى وهو قضية العداء الإسباني الإنجليزي. المسألة الثالثة وهو قضية القرصنة.
I think that what happens through those exchanges of letters is then an ability for people to move back and forth between those different kingdoms. We have Moroccan travellers who come to London. We have London merchants who go to Morocco. And Elizabeth's letters and Al-Mansur's responses saying, yes, I think we can do business. I think that we can have a political alliance. I think that we can both accept and tolerate each other's religions and perhaps start to understand them a bit more. Certainly more than Catholicism will do, because Catholicism simply says Protestantism and Islam are heresies.
بعد سنوات من المراسلات الودية بين الملكة إليزابيث الأولى والسلطان مراد الثالث والسلطان منصور الذهبي، وحصول الملكة على امتيازات تجارية ودبلوماسية لبلادها، ستمني إليزابيث الأولى النفس في إقامة حلف عسكري ضد عدو مشترك، إسبانيا. وفي سنة 1587 سيقرر الملك الإسباني فيليب الثاني غزو إنجلترا في محاولة لإعادتها إلى حضن الكنيسة الكاثوليكية في روما، في حرب ستعرف بحرب الأرمادة.
So there's this idea in international politics that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And this is the kind of situation we see in the development of this early relationship between England and the Ottomans. It's not that Elizabeth particularly wants to be friends with Murad or the other way around. The Ottomans don't even really know what England is and barely know where it is on the map. It's not an important part of the world as far as they're concerned. But what the English and the Ottomans do have in common is an enemy, and that enemy is Spain.
So in this period, because Catholic Spain is trying to really get rid, trying to what we call reconquer, the Reconquista. This is the tradition that goes back to the late 15th century of Spanish Catholic powers pushing back and pushing out the Muslim presence in Al-Andalus, as it was. This is something that really still carries on. We need to remember that in southern Spain there are still Muslim communities. They are being told that they cannot worship openly, they have to convert. The Spanish Emperor Philip II is very hostile, obviously, to those communities. So there is endless skirmishes, military conflicts really on that border zone between southern Spain and into North Africa.
There is definitely evidence that Elizabeth and her government were trying to establish military links with the Ottomans against Spain. We know this because in the briefs and debriefs of William Harborne and other English ambassadors, this is made quite clear that if they can find a way to get a military alliance, then that's a good thing.
Harborne's efforts posed a difficult challenge for him. On the one hand, he needed to secure for the English the support of the Ottomans. On the other hand, Elizabeth, for her part, didn't want to appear to other European powers to be too close with the Ottomans, to engage in a formal relationship which might undermine her position as a Christian monarch in Europe. Murad III, for his part, was also reluctant to engage in a formal military alliance with the English that would involve the Ottomans heavily in activities in the Western Mediterranean during years when Ottoman military might was really bogged down in fighting a war with Iran. So throughout the 1580s, at different moments, Harborne makes overtures to the Ottoman court. These overtures necessarily need to be handled delicately. And ultimately, though, they never really result in the kind of Ottoman military effort westward against the Spanish that would prevent something like the Spanish Armada from launching an attack on England.
In 1588, we know in English national history, it's a very celebrated moment that the Spanish launch a large naval armada to invade England. It fails. It mainly fails because of bad weather. We've tended to celebrate this as a great imperial victory for the English. I think that we need to be really careful about that because I'm not so convinced by that. But also, another element to why it fails is the Anglo-Islamic alliance, with both Al-Mansour in Morocco and with Murad in Istanbul and the Ottomans.
الأرمدة إسبانيون أو الجيش الإسباني سيتعرض إلى هزيمة كبيرة، وهنا بدأ أحمد المنصور يحس بمدى أهمية التقرب من الملكة إليزابيث الأولى، نظرا لأن العدو مشترك ولأن أحمد المنصور يخطط ويحلم في الحقيقة لكي يسترجع الأندلس. هذا الحلم ظل ملازما له.
The Moroccans respond really interesting. So we have a chronicler called Al-Fishtali who writes about it saying, this is fantastic that the Armada has been defeated because it's good for us if the Spanish have been defeated, but it's also good for our English allies that it's been defeated as well. Now this is being written from Al-Mansour's court, which is showing the extent of the alliance between Morocco and England.
بعد انتصارها في الأرمدة سنة 88 1588 قامت بحرب أخرى أو معركة أخرى وجهتها ضد البرتغال، طبعا إسبانيا، لأن إسبانيا هي التي تحتل البرتغال يومئذ. بعد سنة 1589 فانهزمت في هذه المعركة، فوجهت إليزابيث رسائل متعددة تلوم فيها أحمد المنصور على عدم تحركه. فهو يقول بأن السبب هو أن بريطانيا تحركت لمهاجمة البرتغال دون أن تخبر أحمد المنصور بالهجوم. من جهة أخرى كذلك أن المنصور في هذه المرحلة كان في طور الإعداد والاستعداد لغزوة أو لغزو بلاد السودان. بلاد السودان هنا المقصود بها هو المنطقة التي تمتد عليها الآن أو جزء من المنطقة التي يمتد عليها الآن كل من مالي والنيجر.
في عام 1600 سترسو سفينة ضيف استثنائي في ميناء دوفر، إنه السفير المغربي عبد الواحد عنون أو النوري الذي سيحل ضيفا فوق العادة على الملكة إليزابيث حاملا رسائل من السلطان منصور الذهبي ومكلفا بالكثير من المهام منها الظاهر ومنها الخفي. وتقدم لنا الوثائق التاريخية تفاصيل مثيرة للاهتمام عن حياة الرجل ومقامه لأشهر في العاصمة لندن.
أحمد المنصور بعد معركة وادي المخازن لم يكن يعر اهتماما كبيرا لمكانة إليزابيث. ولكن بعد انتصارها في 1588 بعد سحقه للأرمادة الإسبانية أحس بأهميتها وبدأت، وإنجلترا أيضا أرادت أن تستفيد من المكانة الدولية التي أصبحت عند أحمد المنصور، وقررت أن تستدعي تطلب إرسال سفراء مغاربة إلى إنجلترا. وحين نتحدث عن سفراء في هذا التاريخ فنحن نتحدث عن مبعوثين في الحقيقة. في أغلب الأحيان كانت إنجلترا هي التي تهيئ سفينة وتعدها على الذوق المغربي، حتى لأن المسافة بين المغرب وإنجلترا في البحر هي أكثر من أسبوع أو أسبوعين، لا بد أن تتوفر فيها وسائل الراحة. ثم أن الوفد الذي كان يذهب في هذه السفارة يتكون من أكثر من 20 إلى 30 شخصا، ويكون معهم إمام للصلاة وطباخ، وأحيانا يحملون معهم حتى موادهم الغذائية.
In early 1600, Al-Mansur and Elizabeth have reached a really close alliance, and they want to, I think, turn that into a military alliance. Al-Mansur then chooses a figure to send to London to open very high-level diplomatic, political and military relations with Elizabeth. And he chooses a man that in the records is referred to as Muhammad al-Anuri. Anuri seems to me a fascinating figure. From what we know, it seems that he's possibly from Fez. I suspect that he also had connections with Al-Andalus. I think he may have grown up there. He's clearly a very cosmopolitan figure. He's clearly a very brilliant scholar. He speaks many different languages. He obviously speaks Arabic. He obviously speaks Spanish. He seems to speak a bit of Italian and possibly even a bit of Latin. He is a very cosmopolitan figure. He's the perfect character to send to London. We have a portrait of Anuri. He is painted in 1600. It shows an extraordinary figure. He wears a turban. He looks straight at you. He has his dagger. He's beautifully dressed. He meets your eye. This is a powerful, confident, clever guy.
هذا عبد الواحد ابن علي الملقب به عنون أو جنون على كل حال. هذا الرجل كذلك كان رجلا مثقفا، كان عالما، حرر تقريرا مهما جدا عن بلاد المغرب نقله إلى إليزابيث، ونقل كذلك تقريرا عن إنجلترا إلى بلاد المغرب. وكان هذا السفير قد استقبل استقبالا رسميا.
شارع ستراند من أهم شوارع العاصمة لندن وأكثرها عراقة، كان شاهداً على تفاصيل الحياة اليومية للسفير النوري والوفد المرافق له. وبين بناياته أحيا الوفد المغربي شعائره الدينية التي استأثرت باهتمام سكان العاصمة وأثارت فضولهم.
He arrives in Dover with great fanfare with his entourage, a whole team who've come with him. The Barbary Company representatives take him to London in great fanfare. He travels down the river. He is given a huge house on the Strand, one of the biggest, most expensive streets in Elizabethan London, as it still is today. There are accounts of people being fascinated by seeing the entourage move around London. Diarists talk about how they pray. They talk about how they slaughter their meat, halal. The descriptions are very precise. He is religiously observant. He brings holy men with him. The Barbary Company have no problem with this at all. In the process, he meets Elizabeth twice. He goes to Hampton Court, still one of the great palaces. He has a subsequent meeting at a place called Oatlands, which is a palace which has now disappeared. But Elizabeth treats this man as very important. In November 1600, Elizabeth has a very famous celebration called the Accession Day celebration, which is in Whitehall, where the current Horse Guards Parade is. It's still there. And she invites all the ambassadors, all the great elite of Europe to come and see her and celebrate this day of her accession. we have a record of Anuri being there.
وفي هذه السفارة ستنكشف الأوراق، لأن تبين أن أحمد المنصور أحلامه بعيدة جدا، وهو يطمع في أن الملكة إليزابيث يجب أن تساعده على استرداد الحكم الإسلامي في الأندلس.
They are agreeing a military alliance where the English Navy will support Al-Mansur's army to take back areas of southern Spain. And not only that, they talk about then using the English Navy with Muslim soldiers to try and even conquer parts of the American New World that the Catholic Spanish are in control of. This is an extraordinary.
في هذه السفارة سوف يكتشف السفير أو المبعوث المغربي أن الملكة إليزابيث حاولت أن تستقطب اهتمام الموريسكيين الذين كانوا في خدمة أحمد المنصور لكي تدخلهم في جيشها ولكي تستعملهم في حربها ضد الإسبان. وفهم ذلك السفير العنوري حين لاحظ بأن ترجمانه الذي كان يتكلم الإسبانية بدأ يتكلم باللغة الإيطالية مع الملكة إليزابيث، فأحس بأن الموضوع فيه شيئا ما ليس على ما يرام، فاستطاع أن يعرف بأن إنجلترا تريد من الموريسكيين، وهم يمثلون النخبة العسكرية في جيش أحمد المنصور، لكي تلحقهم بقوتها. فعلم بطبيعة الحال أحمد المنصور في 1601 سنة بعد ذلك بالخبر، وكان رده عنيفا للملكة إليزابيث، وقال لها بأنني على بينة من هذه المؤامرة التي تريد تدبيرها مع عناصر من جيشي، وفهم بأنه لا يمكن أن يعتمد عليها. هي الأخرى فهمت بأنه لا يمكن الاعتماد على أحمد المنصور لتقديم السند لأمير البرتغال لكي يستعيد عرشه.
What then happens is it falls apart, but it doesn't fall apart because of some Christian-Muslim conflict. It falls apart because Elizabeth backs away from the deal, because her long-standing alliance, which transcends the deal with Al-Mansur, is with the Ottomans. And she realizes that if she signs that deal with Al-Mansur, it could compromise her ongoing alliance with the Ottomans. So it's a very complicated deal which collapses, not because she has some antagonism to Al-Mansur, but because she's worried at what it might do to the Ottomans. It might antagonize and alienate them.
بعد نجاح الملكة إليزابيث الأولى في توقيع الكثير من الاتفاقيات التجارية والدبلوماسية مع الإمبراطورية العثمانية والدولة السعدية، ستصل الكثير من الوفود المسلمة إلى العاصمة لندن. وصول هذه الوفود لم يكن بالحدث العادي، بل سيثير فضول ساكنة المدينة، وأيضا سيثير انتباه عدد من المسرحيين الإنجليز الذين كانوا حينها يؤسسون لمرحلتهم الذهبية. سيحاولون هؤلاء تخليد هذه المرحلة التاريخية وتجسيد هذه الشخصيات المسلمة التي وصلت بأزياء مختلفة وأسماء مختلفة وطباع مختلفة، والأهم بديانة جديدة على المجتمع الإنجليزي. كل هذا سيحضر في الكثير من الأعمال المسرحية الإنجليزية، لعل أهمها وأشهرها هو ما يخلده هذا المكان، مسرح شكسبير.
The culture in England specifically during the reign of Queen Elizabeth is really kind of remarkable. I mean, it's really an amazing time to be thinking about. There are the rise of what we understand or would recognize as the modern commercial theater. There is also very much kind of the print revolution, which began on the continent a bit earlier, but is now translated over into England, specifically in London, where the book trade takes off, and suddenly, with the use of the printing press, information, literature of all kinds is suddenly available. It's the democratization of literature and information in some ways, that first phase of it, and all of the kind of mixing of ideas that comes with that. At the same time, England is starting to take its first steps into kind of the global market. So the empire is starting that very initial bits of kind of creating trade with other countries.
Once we know that from the 1550s there's an extensive and really amicable alliance between Elizabethan England and the Islamic world, the drama of this period, which we mainly talk about Shakespeare's drama, the great English, Elizabethan theatre, it is full of plays about Islam. Now, England doesn't have the word, it's not available at that point. So the word Islam and Muslim enters the language in the 1610s, 1620s. So if one looks at the Oxford English Dictionary, those are the first usages. That doesn't mean there isn't an understanding of Islam in this period. There are synonyms, other words which are used, Turk, Saracen, Persian, Moor, all these different terms are referring in different ways to what the English vaguely are understanding as Islam, Muslim characters. On the English stage, it is full of these characters, and people have forgotten this, or they've never even really acknowledged it. So the English theatre really starts from the late 1580s, which is when the Elizabethan theatre really takes off. Playwrights like Christopher Marlowe and William Shakespeare are filling their plays with Moors, Saracens, Turks. Marlowe particularly, Marlowe's play Tamburlaine talks about the Quran. Marlowe has read the Quran, okay? Shakespeare, I'm not convinced that he's read the Quran, but in a play that very few people ever read, Henry VI, the French king refers to the Prophet Muhammad. Now this is amazing. There is Shakespeare talking about the Prophet Muhammad. And we see that throughout his plays, there are characters that we would call Muslim.
خشبة المسرح هي فرصة لنقل هذه المظاهر، وأول مسرحية ستنقل هذه المظاهر هي مسرحية بيل التي كان عنوانها The Battle of Alcazar، معركة القصر الكبير، والتي نقلت فيها إلى الجمهور أو إلى المتفرجين الإنجليز أحداث معركة وادي المخازن. وهذه المعركة شخصوها بطريقة رفعوا فيها من قيمة أحمد المنصور.
And then, famously, around 1601, 1602, Shakespeare writes Othello, the Moor of Venice, this extraordinary figure who marries a Venetian woman. He's a very noble soldier. He is destroyed by that Christian society.
I think, like most writers, Shakespeare looked around the world that he was living in, and especially the goings-on in the city of London. The first, and probably the best known, is the visit of the Moroccan ambassador in 1600 to the court of Queen Elizabeth. He comes with an entourage of 15 other men from the court of the King of Barbary, and they stay for 6 months in the city of London. I think actually a more poignant kind of connection actually is there are echoes of in Othello's character to a very specific publication that was written by a Muslim man who has a lot of experiences that echo characteristics that Shakespeare infuses into Othello. His name was Joannes Leo Africanus. He writes a book in 1550 called The Geographical History of Africa, where he kind of expresses and describes the qualities of African people kind of just, from his experience. This book is translated into English, which is where it becomes, a touchstone for Shakespeare's inspiration. It's translated into English in 1600, which is a really key time for us because, of course, it's when the Moroccan ambassador appears and on his embassy, and it's also in the year just before Shakespeare is writing Othello, which is about 1603-04, and then shortly after it appears on stage. But all of these elements we can find mentions of when Othello is describing his own life. There's an extended speech that Othello gives in the play where he is recounting his adventures, the elements of his life that Desdemona was so enchanted by that they actually moved her to pity and then to grow to love him. And he specifically mentions, his many adventures where he has, he gets away, just barely gets away from danger, which is another point that is made, Pori makes about Africanus in his dedication. He travels widely. Othello specifically mentions having been enslaved himself, which is another key detail. When I hear that and reread those lines in the context of this wider interest in these Muslim characters coming in, it's hard not to see that, Shakespeare, listening to kind of the wider influences and just kind of the murmurings through, the people that he's seeing in the pub or in the streets or whatever, and incorporating that. These were stories that people would have been interested in. So he is speaking to the people who are in the room with him, and he's asked them to tell his story. Set you down this, and say besides that in Aleppo once, where a malignant and turbaned Turk beat a Venetian and traduced the state, I took by the throat the circumcised dog and smote him thus, and then he stabs himself. Obviously, and they're the two references that are usually highlighted in this, of the turbaned Turk and the circumcised dog, are lifted from a poem that was written by James I. At the time he's James VI. And it's kind of a propaganda poem. So again, it's another kind of way that Shakespeare's pulling references from the popular culture, but they're processed through English and, in James's case, Scottish kind of interpretations, and they're all kind of drawing on this anxiety about Ottomans and Muslims.
We need to remember that in this period, we also have stories, which I believe Shakespeare knows about, of English men who convert to Islam. We do not have many stories of Muslims who convert to Christianity. But we have these extraordinary stories throughout the 1580s and 1590s of, admittedly, some are forcible conversions, but some are not. And I think if you're an English Protestant merchant working in the Mediterranean in the 1580s, thinking that at any moment your religion is going to be rolled over by Catholicism, I think that to embrace the faith of Islam looks very attractive. Now again, we need to think about that really carefully historically, because that is not a story that Western Christianity tells of itself. And that is an important element that we really need to put back into that history.
لم تتوقف علاقة الملكة إليزابيث بالعالم الإسلامي بالمراسلات مع السلاطين ولا باستقبال التجار والدبلوماسيين المسلمين، بل ستقتحم الثقافة الإسلامية بلاط الملكة وتصبح قريبة منها وجزءاً من حياتها اليومية، بفضل سيدة ستصل البلاد كخادمة من بلاد فارس، لكن مصيرها داخل القصر سيتحول بشكل مثير للإعجاب.
One of the interesting figures in this whole Anglo-Islamic relationship is a man called Anthony Jenkinson. And Anthony Jenkinson is a merchant who, as early as the 1550s, is travelling as far as Persia. He's going via Moscow and he's working for what's called the Muscovy Company. But Jenkinson's attempt is to reach Persia, so is to connect with an Islamic empire, with the Persians. And indeed he does this. As he's travelling throughout that region, he buys a young woman who he calls Aura Sultana. She seems to be a slave girl at this time. He takes her back to England, and the records suggest that she becomes a serving woman at Elizabeth I's court. So it shows us that by the 1560s, a woman like Aura Sultana, who I think we must assume is Muslim, is a slave but is taken to England, and we assume is then given to some extent her freedom, and she is a servant at Elizabeth's court. The stories that are told is that Elizabeth likes her because she brings new fashions to the court. And this is another interesting element where you see the Islamic influence on the Elizabethan period. She becomes in effect a kind of a fashion advisor as we would see it today. She's clearly bringing in silks, she's advising on different fabrics, she's advising on shoes, we believe. There's a whole thing about shoes, of course, that Elizabeth is wanting the latest fashionable shoes. This has not changed over history. So Aura Sultana is advising, and Elizabeth is fascinated by this because regardless of religion or political belief, she's wanting what's very fashionable and what's very expensive. So if you can be shown to be wearing silk that's come from the Ottoman territories via China, then this shows that you have great power. So it's a way of both being fashionable, but showing your authority. Look, I can wear silk from China, it's expensive, and it also is a sign of the alliances I can make with other great empires in the Islamic world.
وضعت أورا سلطانة الخادمة المسلمة لمستها الخاصة على أزياء الملكة، وفتحت المراسلات بين إليزابيث وسلاطين الدول الإسلامية الباب أمام تعرف النخبة الإنجليزية على الإسلام. أما الوفود التجارية فقد تركت أثراً ظهر بشكل تدريجي في حياة الإنجليز، وما زالت تأثيراته ممتدة إلى اليوم.
It takes a long time for there to be a general change in food culture, but certainly the easy arrival of lots and lots of currants and raisins is a very important development. In one of the treaties, the early treaties between the English and the Ottomans, there's a specified clause that says that the monarch of England can have a whole shipful of currants at least once a year for their own personal consumption. And if we look at English cuisine in this period, everything kind of is like a Christmas pudding. There's lots of currants in everything, even if they shouldn't probably be there. But this also allows the English to get access through the Ottomans to other kinds of commodities such as spices that they are then able to import.
The impact of all this trade, especially with Morocco, I think is absolutely profound. I think that it changes so many aspects of domestic life in England. It changes the language. So through those forms of communication and through those trade, Arabic words enter the English language. So words like tulip, words like turban, zero, these kinds of phrases enter the English language. If you look at the Oxford English Dictionary, these words from Arabic enter English in the late 16th century. They are a result directly of the trade. You know, trade comes with language, so those things are affected as well.
But what we do see is lots of English people starting to travel to the Ottoman Empire, both in Istanbul, in the Middle East, and especially in North Africa. If we imagine somewhere like Algiers or Damascus or Istanbul, these are places with baths and running water and soup kitchens for the poor, kind of proto-welfare institutions that simply didn't exist in the same way in England. There's the opportunity for social mobility. In the Ottoman Empire, although there is a class structure, it's not based on a hereditary nobility like it is in England. You can go and convert to Islam like many English people do in the late 16th century and become very high up members of the local elites. We have a number of examples of English people in the late 16th and the early 17th century becoming major captains and admirals of the Ottoman Navy, the heads of elite households. So the opening up of trade has this unintended consequence of opening up the Islamic world to English people. But that's also a potentially dangerous thing. These people might come back with new ideas. They might come back saying, actually Islam is better than Protestantism. And so at the same time that this is happening, a kind of propaganda campaign begins in England that starts to paint the Ottoman Mediterranean as a dangerous place. If you go there, they're going to take you as a slave and they're going to force you to become a Muslim. If you go there, you're going to encounter all these evil ideas through Islam. It's a bad religion. You shouldn't listen to it. You shouldn't read the Quran. You shouldn't listen to any of these ideas.
But again, the way in which gold comes into the country, the various different kinds of spices that come in, pepper, nutmeg, these things are suddenly entering the kitchen. They're in your beer. They're in what people are drinking. Also in terms of fabrics, silks, velvet, which is coming in, people start to wear them. People start to decorate their houses. We have descriptions in Shakespeare's plays of people in their houses having embroideries which are from Muslim domains. They talk about Turkey carpets. So people are importing Turkish carpets. So it's changing your house. It's changing what you eat. It's changing the language that you speak. It's having a massive impact.
لم تكن الملكة إليزابيث تعلم تبعات قرارها التمرد على الكنيسة الكاثوليكية في روما. لم تكن تعرف شيئا عن الإمبراطورية العثمانية ولا عن الدولة السعدية. لم تسمع يوما عن الإمبراطور العثماني مراد الثالث ولا عن السلطان السعدي المنصور الذهبي. لكننا الآن نعرف بأن بلدين مسلمين قويين أخرجا إنجلترا من حصار أوروبي خانق، ونعرف أيضا بأن الملكة إليزابيث الأولى نجحت في إبرام اتفاقيات سياسية ودبلوماسية وتجارية مع العثمانيين في المشرق والسعديين في المغرب. علاقات ظلت ممتدة لقرون وبقيت متجلية في الحياة الثقافية والسياسية والفنية لبريطانيا اليوم.